So, okay, so tonight's talk is going to be on suffering. So I hope it doesn't put you off. I don't see too many people walking out straight away, which is a good sign. It's important to talk about suffering because it is a very basic, a very fundamental part of the Buddha's teachings. And to understand suffering actually gives you that incentive to practice the Buddha's teachings. If you don't understand suffering properly, you can't even really get started on this Buddhist path. So it's very important to understand what this is all about. Often we talk about happiness in Buddhism, and certainly it's important to talk about happiness. Happiness is very much an aspect also of the Buddha's teachings. You can, for example, talk about the Four Noble Truths in terms of happiness rather than suffering. For those of you who don't know the Four Noble Truths, they essentially are the truth of suffering, that there is suffering, the second Noble Truth, which is the origin or the cause of that suffering, third one, the ending of suffering, and the last one, which is the path that leads to the end of suffering. And these Four Noble Truths are like the most fundamental, most basic aspect of the Buddha's teaching. They summarize basically everything else that you find in Buddhism. So everything can be contained within these Four Noble Truths. They're very important, they're very central. And you will see straight away that they are all about suffering. The most central part of the Buddhism is essentially about suffering. So for that reason it's very important. And it's more profound in many ways to talk about suffering than happiness. The truth of suffering is more profound than talking about happiness. And you will obviously understand, sometimes you may have read the suttas, the word of the Buddha, and you may have seen that sometimes the Buddha is compared to like a doctor, a physician. He is somebody who helps us with our problems, and what he helps us with is essentially the problem of suffering. That's why the Buddha is there. This is the thing that he has discovered in the world. There is a problem to be solved, and he has discovered a solution to that problem. Of course, if you don't realize that there is such a thing as suffering, if you don't understand that there is a problem in the first place, there's no reason to go to the Buddha and say, please help out. What can we do to make an end of this problem? So if you don't have an understanding of suffering, if you don't know what is meant by this, essentially there is no beginning of this Buddhist path for you at all, because there's no problem to be solved for you. There's no problem to be solved. You're going to not look for a solution. So for this reason it's important to understand suffering, what it's all about. And I remember, just to continue on this idea of seeing the problem and then finding a solution to that problem afterwards. I remember a few years ago I read an article in some kind of Buddhist magazine, and this was an article written by a young woman in her mid-20s or something, I think, and she had essentially become a Buddhist. And one day she decided to go to one of her friends and say, listen, I found this wonderful teaching. And the other one asked, well, what is it about? Well, it's about suffering. And the other person says, well, I don't really have any suffering in my life. So, end of story. And that's what happens. If you don't see that there is a problem to be solved, there is no point in searching any further. You won't have any interest in the Buddha's teachings at all, because there's nothing there for you. And it's interesting, when I read that myself, I can't remember, a few years ago, whenever it was, my first reaction to reading that somebody says that I don't see any suffering in my life, my first reaction was, well, this person must be in denial. They don't really understand what's going on. Or maybe more appropriate, rather than saying denial, I think it's probably more accurate to say this person hasn't really reflected on life, what life entails. If you do reflect on life carefully, it is not that hard to see that life also entails suffering. It's actually very easy to say. I'm going to show this in a few minutes. But the interesting thing was that after a while, I came back to this person who said this, and after a while it occurred to me that actually there is some truth to what this person is saying as well. He's saying, I can't see any suffering in life. And the reality is, of course, that as human beings, our life isn't that miserable. It's not as if it is one unbroken sequence of suffering all the time. We also have lots of happiness as human beings. We have joys, we have good things in life. It's not just misery all the time. And in fact, if you see what the Buddha said, as a human being, essentially the majority of your time you're going to have some sort of happiness in your life. Of course, there are sufferings in life, there are problems, there are griefs, there are depressions and all this kind of thing. But on average, it is not all that bad. So he had a point. I can't really understand this idea of suffering. There is a point to that. And this is what I want to come back to afterwards, because the vast majority of what the Buddha called suffering is in fact not the type which is visible straight away. You can't see that. And you have to rely on a certain amount of insight maybe, or confidence in the teaching of the Buddha perhaps, or intuition if you like, all these other factors to understand the deeper aspect of suffering and how profound it actually is. And it is only at that point that you understand what the Buddha meant by this thing we call suffering. So, first of all then, I want to talk about the things that he should have reflected about this person when he said there wasn't any suffering, and what he didn't reflect, what he didn't do, what he should have done. And the first thing, of course, and one of the most important things that is suffering in our lives is death. Death is just so important. And I think sometimes people don't realize this, don't understand the significance of death. Sometimes we think perhaps that, well, when I get there, I will deal with it. Or they think when I die, it will all be nice and peaceful, I'll just pass away, that will be the end of it. But the reality is that death is very often very traumatic for people. It's very difficult. And as a monk, I have seen many people on their deathbed dying, and it's often even if they've been good Buddhists and practicing for many, many years, still, very often they find it a very difficult time. And it's important to realize that death is usually not some kind of easy thing. You just fall asleep, and when you wake up, so to speak, you are dead. But it isn't like that. It actually is usually very difficult and very traumatic. And I remember reading a book a few years ago about dying. The book was called How We Die, by a famous, quite well-known American doctor. And he basically laid it out. He told it straight what it's like to die. And it's not very beautiful usually. Important to remember this. Why is it that death is so difficult? Well, there are many reasons. The first one is obviously the pain that we often go through. We often have terminal illnesses, our organs stop functioning, all these kind of things. This is one of the important things. Most people have enormous problems towards the end of their lives. I think I read a statistic somewhere that people, they have about 90% of the medical bills throughout their life is accumulated over the last 6 months of their life. That is quite remarkable. That says something about the problems you have. So the first thing is the pain of death. The second thing about death is, of course, we have to let go of pretty much everything in this life. So whatever attachments you have in this life, everything, pretty much everything, has to be let go of. And that is hard. When you first realize you're going to die, it's very difficult. It takes a long time to come to terms with this. Friends, family, everything you own, and ultimately also your own body has to be let go of. It is not easy. It is actually very hard, this. And just to add another last bit, of course, which is also very difficult with death, is we don't know where we're going afterwards. There's this uncertainty, insecurity about what happens after we die. So just to make sure that there's enough, if there isn't enough problems already, we have that uncertainty on top of everything else. So for these reasons, death is a very hard and difficult time, and it's difficult to deal with. And for that reason, it's important to be realistic about this, to reflect on this, to understand that this actually is a problem there. It is not something which is necessarily going to be easy. Why is it so hard? Why is it that so many people don't think about death? Why is it that so many people, even this person I was talking about before, didn't even think that death was suffering in his life? How can that be when it's so obvious that we're all going to die? And the reason is because the Buddha had something he called the intoxication of being alive. When you are alive, you have the energy, you have the vitality, you have the strength, you have this feeling that you can go out there and do things, the world is my oyster kind of thing. But the reality is, of course, that this is an intoxication, and it takes away from remembering that there is an end to all this. It's not going to go on like this forever. And the end could come often much sooner than we actually realize or we want to know. So for that reason, it's important to reflect on these things. Remember that these things are a reality. Seeing it happening around us, it's very important. So this is the first, and this is one of the very big, certainly, sufferings in human life. I know sometimes when people they are told that they have a terminal illness, the first reaction is usually very, very negative. There are very few people who can just sit back and say, oh, no worries, this is no problem, I expected this to happen. It just doesn't happen that way. Usually people get very upset and very concerned when they first hear that they have a terminal illness. This is just the nature of things. Sometimes I think about myself, how would I react? I've been a monk now for about 15 years. And sometimes I like to think that I wouldn't be concerned if I was told that I had a terminal cancer, for example. But the reality is I don't really know exactly how I would react. If I was told that I had a terminal cancer, perhaps I wouldn't react too badly. But perhaps I would get upset. It's very hard to know these things before it actually happens to you. And I think we all should be quite humble in the face of these things, because they are big, big issues. So that is the first aspect of suffering. The second one is obviously things like illness. You get sick, and many of us, if you are young, you don't have much illnesses usually, and it's easy to forget that illnesses can also come at any time. And illnesses are terrible. I must admit I haven't had any bad illness myself for a long, long time, but I certainly remember what it's like to have a severe fever and being just lying in bed, barely being able to breathe sometimes. It's terrible. And this is part and parcel of being alive, that we get these illnesses all the time. And again, the Buddha said, why is it that we cannot see these illnesses? Why is it that we forget about this type of suffering? And again, it is because we have this intoxication of health, we call this. And we are intoxicated because we feel we have the energy and the vigor of health. We forget that this is bound to change at some stage, sooner or later. It's the nature of life that these things will change. Then there are, of course, all kinds of suffering apart from this. The suffering of having possessions which we can no longer control, the house, a car which gets stolen, possessions which get damaged by somebody, something which may be very dear to us, but gets taken away somehow. And of course, even more important are our family members and maybe dear friends, when they either suddenly don't want to see us anymore, or they die, or they get ill, or something happens which breaks that bond, that attachment that we have there. All of these things are sufferings in life. It's not difficult to see that life is suffering. It's only that we tend to forget these things when things are going well. So we have to actually bring it up to mind. And this is the purpose of this kind of thing, is that reflecting on suffering is a kind of meditation practice in its own right. It's a contemplation. It's a vipassana contemplation, because it is about understanding the reality of things. And we do tend, every one of us, I think, to be complacent when things go well. So we should always bring these things into mind. And you may perhaps have noticed that the things I just talked about now, all of these are in a sense a kind of suffering of impermanence. When you die, it is your body that is impermanent and everything else. When you get sick, it is your health which is impermanent. When your possessions disappear one way or another, and they often do, again it's impermanence. When your family and friends disappear, die, whatever it is, again it's impermanence. And for this reason, impermanence and suffering almost always go together. And the Buddha said that if something is impermanent, by definition it is also suffering. So this is another reflection we can do, remembering that all those things out there which are impermanent is suffering. And is there anything which isn't impermanent? No. For that reason, pretty much everything is suffering one way or another. So why is it that the things which are impermanent are suffering? Well, it's very simple really. Because we attach to things, we hold on to things, then impermanence comes along and rips it away from us. Then And that attachment, or that clinging onto things, somehow that bond gets broken, and it's always going to be painful. So attachment combined with impermanence equates to suffering. That's what it basically is. So why is it then that it's so hard to see this impermanence? Why is it that not everybody sees this? It should be pretty obvious, really. Well, the reason we cannot see impermanence is because we think that we are in charge. We think that we can control things. We think that we are going to secure our possessions in a smart way, which nobody else has figured out, with the right kind of security and living in the right place and all these kind of things. We're going to be nice and kind to our family members, so there's no problems there. Nobody's going to leave us or go away. We're going to look after our body by exercising and eating the right thing. We're going to control things. And because we're going to control things, we're not going to have all this suffering here. Of course, that is just delusion, unfortunately. It's something we all fall for, this idea. And it comes from a very central part of us, this sense that we are in charge, that we can control. And this, of course, is just the delusion that there is a self in here which can do this kind of controlling around it. But we're not in charge. And that is why things are impermanent. We can't control things. Things will change. Things will go wrong. Sometimes things will go well. No matter what we do. There is no ultimate controller inside of us. And it's important to remember that, because then the impermanence of things becomes so much more obvious when we realize that. So, the idea of non-self means that there is no control, so things must be impermanent. Because things are impermanent, they are suffering. Because we are attached to things, impermanence comes and takes it away from us, there is suffering there. This is one way of looking at this whole issue. So this is the suffering of impermanence, how impermanence always leads to suffering in life. Then there is another type. Well, I can maybe also say that, of course, there's many, many other types of suffering in life. Just to think about, take our body, for example. Is there a single day when we don't have some kind of pain or discomfort in our body? Is there even almost a moment when there's not some kind of discomfort in the body? You have to move around, twitch here and there. This is suffering. Does a day go by when somebody doesn't do something which irritates you or is a little bit insensitive or bad? There's always somebody out there who seems to be difficult for us. Does a day go by when we don't see something which is not nice, or hear something which is not nice, or maybe taste some food that we don't really like? And on it goes like this. On and on and on. You can start counting and there's no end, basically, to all these little small sufferings in life. But then I want to talk about another type of suffering, which is not really maybe as direct, it's much more difficult to see here. And this is the suffering of desire. And when I mean the suffering of desire, I don't mean the suffering of not getting what you want. That's not what I mean. What I mean by suffering of desire is the very suffering inherent in having a desire in the first place. And this is much harder to see. And the reason it's hard to see is because our desires are such an integral part and parcel of who we are that it's almost always there. We're driven forwards by desires, going here, there, restless, all this running around all the time, driven by desires. So it's very hard to see something when it's always there. That's why it is very difficult. But all you really have to do is you have to contemplate what is it like when desires are quite weak compared to when desires and craving are very strong. When desires and craving are very strong, you can feel inside of you what that feels like. It feels restless. It feels like you are driven around by something. It feels like you have no peace. It feels like there's something unfulfilled inside of you. You need something to feel fulfilled. That is what desire feels like when you watch it very carefully. And the more carefully you watch, you will see that this kind of sense of completeness, of fulfillment, is almost always there when there is desire. So the thing to do then, to understand how desire is an affliction and a problem and a type of suffering, very often what we have to do is to go on a meditation retreat, for example, experience some peaceful states of mind, and then when you have that peaceful state of mind, you compare that to when you don't have the peace. And then you understand very quickly that this is because of desire, that there is this kind of basically suffering there which comes from desire. And you will notice here that the reason why we don't understand that desire is suffering is because we don't have perspective on desire. We can't see it because it's always there. And this is very important in Buddhism, because as you practice the Buddhist path, the further along this path you go, the more perspective you have on human life, the more you see all the different types of suffering that we have as human beings. As you move up, you look back and you see, wow, I didn't realize that actually there was a problem there to be solved. And this is very well told, I think, and I'm sure many of you have read Ajahn Brahm's book, Opening Door of Your Heart. And the very last story of that book is called The Worm and His Lovely Pile of Dung. And if you haven't read it, I'm going to tell you in brief what the story is about. The story is two friends living together, and they're very close to death, and soon enough both of them die. And one of these friends is reborn in a heavenly realm. Beautiful, everything is very nice, everything is wonderful, and human existence was nothing compared to all the wonders of this heavenly realm. Everything is just delightful. There's no problems, there's very little suffering compared to human existence. But his friend is born as a worm in a pile of dung. So then after a while, this friend who is born in the heavenly realm, he wonders, well, what happened to my friend? Why isn't he also here in this heavenly realm? So he starts looking around in this thing we call samsara, looking around, seeing if maybe he's been reborn as a human being, or maybe he's in some other kind of animal. And after looking around everywhere, eventually he finds out that this friend has been reborn as a worm in a pile of dung. And of course, because they were very good friends, he feels compassion for his friend. That's terrible, my good friend is reborn as a worm in a pile of dung. What suffering to live in this stinking dung day and night all the time. So then he decides, I will go down to my friend and I will tell him about the wonders of the heavenly realm, and I will take him up to heaven to show him the wonders of living in this particular place. So he goes down to his friend the worm and says to him, listen, do you remember me? We used to live together as friends before on earth, or as human beings. I have been reborn in this beautiful, wonderful heavenly realm. Would you perhaps like to come up with me and have a look at these wonders of the heavenly realm? And the worm looks out at his friends, and all he can feel is a sense of fear. No, go away. I don't want to know anything about this heavenly realm. Don't want to see you again. Go away. And this friend tries again to persuade this friend, the worm, to come and see the heavenly realm because it's so wonderful. Why on earth do you want to cling on to this stinking dung when you can go to something very beautiful and wonderful? But again, the worm just tells him the worm can't even imagine what the heavenly realm is. So it tells him just to get lost, basically. Go away, don't want to see you, I want to stay in my pile of dung. And of course, eventually, this person reborn in the heavenly realm, he even grasps hold of this worm, tries to pull him out of this worm of dung this pile of dung. And then, every time, because the little worm is very slippery, he loses grip, and the worm crawls back into the dung again. Eventually, this being gives up, and is very sad for his friend, but goes back to the heavenly realm and realizes he cannot really do anything for this friend. And the point of this story is that we get attached to the most amazing things. And this little worm, he's attached to this pile of dung. For him, the pile of dung is his home, it's what he feeds on, it's what he eats, it feels nice and warm and all these kind of things. So even though it is really stinking and terrible, he's attached to this. And of course, the point is that most of us are to some extent, in the same position. We are also attached to our own dung. And that is the problem of life. And this is what I mean by a lack of perspective. As you practice the path and you go higher up and you look back, that is when you realize that what you were attached to before was not worthy of attachment, because essentially it just gives rise to desires and cravings, it gives rise to restlessness and all these things which inside are not actually nice. They're actually a type of suffering. You've been attached to that suffering, you've been holding on to something that was not nice.
And Ajahn Brahmali always likes to say that his job in life is to try to pull people out of the pile of dung. And it is a nice way of putting it. I'm not saying that I'm not in a pile of dung. I think to a large extent probably I am. But we're all basically in this boat together, where there is all this dung that we have to get out of. And we can't really see that this dung is there. So as you practice the path and you look back, that is only then that you understand that there is a problem there. And of course, when we get to this point, when we talk about suffering which we cannot see, this is when we start to go over to the territory of what this man who's saying he doesn't see any suffering in his life. We're getting into that area now, because he doesn't see suffering simply because he's not able to see it. He's attached to what he's doing right now. He cannot see anything higher and better than that. But this is only a small part of the suffering of this thing we call existence. What I've talked about so far is things which, at least in theory, are visible right here, right now for each one of us. But that is only a tiny, insignificant, really, portion of the suffering of existence. Because, and this is of course the main reason why this person could not relate to the idea of suffering, is precisely because this other part of suffering is not visible. You can't see it. And again, as I said before, human life is not always that bad. Usually human life is quite good. And it's natural that we have to, that we don't see it as such an enormous problem. It's only when we see the overview, the big picture, and we have faith and confidence in that, that we really understand what suffering is all about. And what is that big picture? That big picture is rebirth. That is the big picture. And that is the real problem in Buddhism. That is the problem that ultimately we have to solve. This is where the problem lies. Sometimes people think that rebirth is like something nice because it gives me a chance to come back again and undo all the mistakes I did in my last life. But that is the wrong view according to Buddhism. Buddhism, rebirth is not a positive thing. Sometimes people say that, oh, this idea of rebirth is just wishful thinking because, you want to exist. But if you understand Buddhism properly, it's not wishful thinking at all. It's the opposite. It's something very negative, something very painful. It's a big, big problem that needs to be solved. And all you have to do is reflect on this thing for a while. Reflect for a while what it means to be born again and again and again. To get old again and again and again. Die again and again and again. Go through childhood, through youth, through your education, get married, get divorced, have children. Life after life after life after life after life after life after life. After a while you think, boy, I've done this so many times. Why on earth do I want to do this thing again? It's a very good point, isn't it? Why do you want to do this thing again? It doesn't make any sense. And sometimes we don't learn anything from life. We do exactly the same mistakes that we did in last life. Why? Because we can't remember our previous life. Sometimes we can, but most of the time we can't. So we end up doing the same mistakes again and again. And of course, after a while, when you think like that, you realize this is doesn't make no sense at all. Just going around in circles, around and around and around, not getting anywhere, not actually really doing anything useful. Just suffering, being happy, suffering, round and around. That is why rebirth is so useless. It's actually worse than useless, because the point is that sometimes we get reborn in a good way. We're all human beings here now, and of course for that reason things are reasonably good for us. Sometimes you're not so lucky. Sometimes you get reborn in a bad state, maybe in a bad country, in a place where there's war and problem and torture, and the government doesn't look after you. Or maybe even worse things you get reborn into. And when you see this fluctuating suffering and happiness going up and down, round and round, without purpose, essentially without end, then you start to think, I have to get out of this problem. This is the real problem of Buddhism. And this is what suffering ultimately is all about. Of course we can't see this. And because we can't see it, it becomes problematic for some people. They say, rebirth, don't know about that. That sounds dodgy to me. But I think even if you don't necessarily believe in it, it's good to have at least an open mind about rebirth. Once you think that there might be such a thing as rebirth, say you give it a 10% chance, because the consequences are so enormous, a 10% chance means you've got to do something straight away. So what did the Buddha say about rebirth? Let's look very briefly. Because we are talking about suffering here, let's look at the first noble truth of the Buddha. Now, the first noble truth is defined and spelled out in the suttas, in the Buddha's discourses. And when you read the first noble truth, the first thing that is listed as suffering in the first noble truth is birth. Jati is called in the Pali language. That's the first thing which is listed there. Now, what does birth mean in this context of the first noble truth? Well, remember that the first noble truth, suffering, is something we're supposed to overcome. We're supposed to make an end to this. Now, the only type of birth you can make an end to is future birth. The birth which has already happened, too late. You can't do anything about the birth you already had. It's only future birth that we can make an end of. So birth in the first noble truth means future birth. It means rebirth. So there you are, the very first word in the definition of suffering in the first noble truth is rebirth, right there. And then you have all the other aspects of that first noble truth. The Buddha gives this list. He talks about old age, death, being separated from the things that you like and you are attached to and close to, being together with things you don't like. And ultimately, there's the 5 khandhas, the 5 groups or the 5 aspects which make up a human being. But the first one is birth. And all these other aspects of suffering, they are only really a problem once birth is there. Because when this thing gets repeated again and again and again, time after time, sometimes with a lot of suffering, that is when the problem arises. And I don't think many people realize that rebirth is right there in the first noble truth. It's important to understand that. It's an essential part of that truth. Then you go to the second noble truth. As I mentioned before, the second noble truth is about the cause and the origin of suffering. Now, the cause and origin of suffering is craving. Most people who have studied a bit of Buddhism, they will know that straight away. It's one of the most fundamental things of the Buddha's teachings. Now, what is this craving that gives rise to suffering in life? And when you read the second noble truth, you realize that this craving actually is the craving which has to do with rebirth. The Pali word is punnabhava. Punnabhava means again existence or re-existence. It's just the craving which relates to re-existence. This is the craving which leads to suffering in the future. Again, you see, the craving, the cause of suffering, has to do with future birth. That's what it relates to. So here you are, the very core of the Buddha's teachings says that suffering essentially is the suffering of rebirth. Then you have the very well-known knowledge and understanding that the fully enlightened person has when they reach full enlightenment. What is that knowledge? That knowledge is birth has come to an end. There is no more future existence. That is the knowledge. Done is what had to be done. Lived is the holy life. You see here, it all focuses on birth and rebirth. That's the focus of what the arahant, the fully enlightened person, knows when they reach this point. It's all about ending rebirth in this case as well. There's no other knowledge ever given to the arahant. This is or at the point of awakening rather, this is the knowledge which is always given to the arahant, the awakened person. Then there is a nice saying also in the suttas where Venerable Sariputta, he is one of the most famous and wise monks after the Buddha, and he is once asked, what is happiness and what is suffering? And he says, suffering is rebirth, happiness is not to be reborn. So you can see here how once you start to understand, once you start to see these things, it is actually there very prominently in the suttas. So what I'm trying to say here is that rebirth is essentially equivalent with suffering. At the end of the day, the suffering that we can see in this life, okay, it is of course preferable to get rid of that suffering, and the Buddhist path will help you with that as well. But ultimately, in the final analysis, the true suffering in life is the suffering on rebirth, and that is what we have to focus on. Rebirth equals suffering equals samsara. This is the problem. And I say that without rebirth, there is no Buddhism. There's no such thing as Buddhism without rebirth. Sometimes you can read books and they'd say, rebirth, you don't have to really believe in that to be a Buddhist. If you don't believe in if you don't have some sense that there is rebirth, at least being open-minded about it, well, you are cutting out the most significant by far aspect of Buddhism. Yes, it can help you in this life, but this is what it's really about. Sometimes I think to myself, well, if there wasn't any rebirth, would I be a monk? Would I bother being a Buddhist monk? And I think the answer, quite frankly, is no, I probably wouldn't, because this is the big problem in life. This is what this is what it comes down to. And monkhood can also have many other benefits, of course. It can be very peaceful and nice lifestyle in many ways. But you're also giving up a lot, and maybe you wouldn't be willing to give up all those things if there wasn't a very big and serious problem that had to be solved. And of course, this is not only for monks and nuns. This is also true for all of you, for everybody who is inclined towards Buddhism or consider themselves a Buddhist. It's important to have that big picture. When you have the big picture, when you have the full understanding of what is going on, then you can make the right decisions in life, what you want to do. Live your life in such a way that you also move in the direction of reducing rebirth and those kind of problems for the future. So that is what suffering is. Suffering is essentially equivalent to rebirth. Okay, so that is my talk for this evening. So you are now allowed to ask questions if you like, or challenge me, or disagree, or whatever you want. So if anybody has any questions, this is the time. Yes, over there.
So, to follow on what you're saying, in the moment of existence, is the name of the game basically to nail the tendency to what are called pasha, moving on to the moment into the future. Is that like where the field work is done to be creating the big picture effect that you've been talking about? In other words, moving towards the away from pasha.
Yeah, it's part of it. It's certainly part of it, because as you purify the mind from desires and all this running around and roaming around everywhere, of course after a while you get more insight into your life and more understanding. But the really big picture, which actually is about rebirth, it's quite hard to see rebirth, unless you're one of these children that spontaneously remember their past life or something like that, or you have some kind of special experience. It's very difficult to see, and it takes extremely deep meditation to be able to see something as hard to see as rebirth. So the really big picture is hard to see. But of course, as you clear your mind, as you have less desire, as you have less papancha, as you say, at least you understand that aspect of the problem. You understand the aspect that desire and papancha itself is a problem, is a kind of suffering. Yeah?
Even in this life, you can have it's not rebirth, but you can have patterns where you think, here we go again.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Sure. Exactly. Yeah. And that is, of course, one of the difficult things in life, is to actually change our habits and our patterns. It's very hard, because once you get into the groove, you sort of tend to stick to that groove. That's one of the things you have to work with. And whether you're a monk or a lay person, it's the same thing. You have to work with those tendencies which always tend to go. And that's why you do things like loving kindness meditation. I personally think it's a very important aspect of Buddhism to try to do some loving kindness and compassion, because you're actually changing the way you perceive people around you. You're looking at people in a purer, nicer, kinder way. And when you do that, one day you suddenly find that the person who used to irritate you suddenly doesn't irritate you anymore. You think, boy, wow, that's pretty profound. That is wonderful. You're changing the groove of your mind. You're moving away from that particular groove. So the practices that you're doing as a Buddhist, they actually tend to lift you out of those grooves, tend to lift you out of those patterns that you have. And then you can see things in a different way, and it becomes very When you see those things, it's beautiful. It's a wonderful thing. Just be able to see somebody in a positive way, which you always saw in a negative light. It's one of those wonderful benefits of the spiritual path. Yes, sir.
What is non-existence? Or what's the point of non-existence?
Okay, well the point is that you see that there is a problem there, and going around and around in samsara is the problem. So you make an end of that going around and around. That is really what you want. You see the suffering there, and you make an end of that suffering. So that ending of suffering is called nibbana. Now, as long as you make an end of suffering, that is always a beautiful thing. What comes afterwards, what nibbana is, as far as I'm concerned, it's really irrelevant. It doesn't matter what nibbana is, because you're making an end of suffering here. How do you know what? Yeah? What you have to do is that instead of, because what you're doing now is you're philosophizing about something which is very profound and very far away, very hard to see here. So what you have to do instead is you have to practice the path gradually. And as you practice the path, you will see that it actually lifts up your mind. You start to feel more happy, more contented in life. You feel better about yourself. All the positive qualities comes from practicing this path. You even get more self-esteem. You feel better. Everything gets lifted up. And as you do that, then you want to continue, because it's a positive thing here. And as you continue and lifting yourself up more and more and more, letting go of more and more suffering, finding more and more peace and happiness, then you start to understand where this is heading and why it has to head in that direction of ending rebirth. Again, forget about what Nibbana is, because it's about ending suffering. And you can only really understand this for yourself by seeing it in this way, by getting perspective stage by stage as you move upwards. If you find that the Buddhism or the practice of the Dhamma does not give you that happiness, does not give you that contentment, then of course you have good questions to start asking. Well, where is this heading? If it doesn't make you happy, then surely there must be something wrong there. Then either you have misunderstood, you're not practicing correctly, or perhaps some people might argue Buddhism doesn't actually work. It's actually wrong. But I say it does work, and just take it stage by stage and see what happens. Yes, sir. Right, yeah, it's true. Yeah. Yeah. Indeed, yeah. So this is a good point, and this is part of what I was talking about before. These parts are aspects of human suffering. The very fact, going to the toilet is not a wonderful thing. It's something you've got to do. But it's not something which is not something we're proud of as human beings. It's not something that really... and this is part of the suffering of being a human being, for sure. So, the body, if you don't wash it for a few days, you start to smell bad. You've got to keep it going. All these are aspects of the same thing. It's quite true. Start with that, and then as you practice, you move away. You find happiness somewhere else. You realize where the happiness is. Yeah. Any more questions? Yes, sir. If Nibbana is permanent? Once you attain Nibbana, there's no kind of return. Because remember that there's actually nobody who attains Nibbana. So it's not something that... It's not like as if you are there to enjoy it. You're not really here now to enjoy it anyway. There is feeling there, but so that's one of those things which are impermanent. It's a bit like asking, is impermanence permanent? Now, is impermanence permanent or is it not impermanent? As long as you are part of samsara, impermanence is permanent. It's always there. Because impermanence is different. The things which are impermanent in life are the things we can experience, the part of the mind and the body. These are the impermanent things. Impermanence is not a thing, it's a concept. And concepts can be permanent. They're always there. Yes, please. It benefits everyone. Because, well, it depends what you mean by enlightenment. But enlightenment, remember that it actually happens to a living being. Yeah? So you're still alive when you get enlightened. You're still there. Yeah? And of course, if you have the highest possible wisdom you can have from a Buddhist point of view, you enormous benefit to other beings. They say, the Buddha said that even just being able to see somebody who is enlightened is tremendous benefit. Why is that? Because when you see somebody who's enlightened, you think, wow, there's something about this person, I don't know what it is, but they're different from me, and it looks really wonderful, so maybe I should do something here to go in the same direction. So just seeing somebody who's enlightened is tremendous benefit, let alone hearing their teaching and understanding what the Dharma is about. So yes, there are tremendous benefit. And this is, part of the Buddhist life. I mean, for myself as a Buddhist monk, most important part of my life is practicing Buddhism. But another aspect of it is actually teaching these things. It goes together. So teaching and practice goes together. So you're always a benefit to others and a benefit to yourself. There's no distinction between those two things on the Buddhist path. They always go together. Because generosity is beneficial to yourself. Generosity is beneficial to others. You do something good, it benefits yourself, and of course it benefits others. It's not as if these things are not separate, they go together here. Yes?
You mentioned that there is a benefit if you're close to someone enlightened. Now this is a silly question. How in the first place you know someone is
You don't, yeah. But sometimes you have a feeling that somebody is, wow, this person is special. You come into contact with somebody who is very, very peaceful in all situations, never show any kind of irritation or anger, don't show any kind of desire. When everything else is in turmoil, they're still completely at peace. And you think, whoa, such a person doesn't exist. I've never seen anything like that before. You don't know whether they're fully enlightened. Maybe they are just close to enlightenment. You can't know. So what do we do to find out, for example, who you should listen to as a Buddhist? Well, who should we listen to, first of all? And what you have to do is look at those qualities in a person. Do they get angry or not? Do they have lots of desires or not? Do they have delusion or not? They don't have those qualities. You know that they must be, at the very least, practicing in the right way, doing the right thing here. So that is really all you can do. You must observe people. And that's actually a very important thing in Buddhism, to observe people around you. Not to take it for granted that somebody who is a monk or a nun or even a lay teacher, just because they are in a teacher's position or they're wearing brown robes, that makes them enlightened. Of course it doesn't. You always have to have your critical faculties with you, always. And to look, And sometimes people are afraid to look. Sometimes they think, if I look too carefully, I might make bad karma. But the reality is that, of course, we shouldn't be overcritical, we shouldn't be fault-finding, but it's important to investigate things. The Buddha himself said we should investigate. When you see somebody, you should look at them. Do they have good qualities or bad qualities? If they have good qualities, then you place faith in them. If they haven't, you don't. We should investigate in this way. We should trust our own ability to investigate. It's important. We shouldn't just dismiss. If somebody is very famous for being enlightened, for example, but we think that we see things in them which are not quite right, we should never dismiss our own judgment. We should always have a certain faith in our own judgment. It's very important, because sometimes people have undeserved reputations around the world. It's very common. Everybody says, he must be enlightened, because many people say it, more people say it, until they have a reputation which may not be deserved. But ultimately, you're right, you can never actually know whether somebody is fully enlightened. It's actually virtually impossible. You just have to sort of feel your way in this way to find those people who are further on the path than others. Are you happy about the answer? Yeah? Okay, good. Yeah. Any more questions? Yes? You can go a very, very long way without being a monk. You can go very, very far. This is theory. I'm talking theory now. Maybe you have to distinguish between theory and practice. In theory, you can go a very, very long way without being a monk or a nun. According to what the Buddha said, there's 4 stages of enlightenment. You can go to the 3rd stage of enlightenment without being a monk or nun. The 4th one, you have to be a monk or nun, because the 4th one basically means you ban everything. You ban the world, so to speak. And because of that, you cannot really live a household life anymore. But the reality is that in practice, it's a great benefit to live a monastic life, because a monastic life is geared towards enlightenment, it's geared toward these things. You live with a group of people, all practice in the way you do. You have people to discuss the Dhamma with all the time. You have maybe a very good teacher who inspires you to practice in the right way. So everything is geared in that direction. You have the seclusion of a nice kuti. You have wonderful lay people who come and support you every day in the monastery. And all of this together, it gives a very powerful kind of forces coming together to give you a lot of support to do it. So it is very beneficial. But there are lay people who are special. I mean, there are lay people in the Buddhist society here who have very good meditation, for example, who get very deep states of meditation. So it is certain it's possible to do these things as a lay person as well. But I think it's fair to say that it is much more difficult because the influences around you are not so conducive as they are in monastic life. Yeah? Yes, Eddie here. Yeah.
Do you see any similarity?
This is getting difficult. I mean, I don't know what they mean by oneness with God. I think the problem often for me is that different people mean different things by these terms, And in Christianity, you have, from the fundamentalists, you have a very literal reading of the Bible, to people who have a much more who understand Christianity in a very different way. In Buddhism, it's the same. You have Buddhists who virtually believe in a God, who virtually see the Buddha as a kind of God almost. There's a wide span. But if I were to answer that, I would say that the Buddhist idea of Nibbana, if you read the suttas, this is just my understanding of the suttas, I say it's different from the idea of oneness with God. It's significantly different. Yeah. Because in Buddhism, you have to remember that one of the things in Buddhism that we don't really, in many religions, it's about celebrating life, celebrating existence. In Buddhism, we're trying to end samsara. It's a very different idea, It's a very different kind of thing. Yeah. So, I think there are very important distinctions between the different religions, and certainly Buddhism is a religion which probably stands out in very many ways as being different from other religions. You may even ask, is it a religion? Some people have asked that question. Is it a religion? Of course, it all depends on how you define the word religion in the first place. But I think there is a good argument there to say that it's not a religion in the ordinary sense, maybe. Happy with that? Not really. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah.
You only see one light to the window, there's one sun, one moon, and it comes, it should be as a complementary, instead of fighting each other.
Yeah.
Maybe there's only one.
There is only one truth, perhaps, highest truth, but it's not necessarily everybody has found that highest truth, So, anyway, yeah. Yes? Yeah. Mm. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And because if you really want to achieve something, if you have a lot of desire and craving inside of you, it will often maybe blind you to what is the right way of doing things. You're blinded by your own craving, by your own desire. If you're really relaxed about things, your mind is much more clear, and your decision-making ability is much more powerful because of that clarity. So I think there's a lot of truth in that. Yeah. Okay, maybe we should call it a day. Dennis, you want to take over?